Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you all stopped by tonight. Um, we have a special guest with us this evening to talk about some of the things going on in West Virginia and bring you some more up to date on what we've talked about in the past about education and the budget and just all the different things going on. But tonight we have Seth DiStephano, who is the Policy Outreach Director at the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. He's a native of Randolph County and a graduate of Tigris Valley High School. Um, Seth received his BA in liberal arts and sciences from WVU, and he leads the government affairs work at the center. He's especially passionate about food security, tax justice issues, and building a better future for working families through policy change. And he's going to give us a little talk tonight on the impacts of the state budget and some various information about the education system in West Virginia. So I will turn it over now to Seth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you being here today. I appreciate you, Rick, for putting this together. And I am going to share my screen and figure out how to get this old PowerPoint to cooperate. Today, I'm going to spend, I don't know, maybe 20 to 30 minutes kind of talking about the intersection of kind of where we find ourselves in education, public education specifically, and how that intersects with decisions we make regarding taxes and the state budget. And also kind of weaving in probably the most impactful policy change regarding education, and not in a good way, which it's a voucher system known as the Hope Scholarship. So we are going to get into that a little bit. Some of the slides you're going to see are likely to be very specific towards like Randolph County. That's because I want to try and spell it out for you in a local way, if I can, just what the Hope Scholarship is doing to smaller school districts specifically. Okay. What you're looking at here, I think that really kind of sums up why public schools sometimes struggle in West Virginia, which is the chronic underfunding over time. So what you're looking at here is the fact that on a per pupil basis, the state of West Virginia ranks last amongst our surrounding states in what we invest in public education. Okay, we are $2,000 per pupil behind the national average. And so when you talk about things like, what's available to kids in public schools, classroom sizes that, can be smaller or bigger depending on the per pupil investment, the ability to have a workforce that is consistent, well-trained, and sticks around, right? Because of salaries and benefits, like things like the Public Employee Insurance Agency. All of this relates to money, public funding, right? And so if you are starting at a place that is underfunded, and you have been underfunded for a while, budget decisions that make access to revenues more difficult or more sparse, or diverting public revenues to things that aren't public education, have a much more profound impact, right? Being this behind the curve, just from a national perspective, is not great. This does not make West Virginia competitive, right? When you take this and then you take even more away, either through ill-fated tax cuts or voucher systems, the consequences can be pretty devastating, as we have seen all across West Virginia. Just so folks know, the school aid funding formula, which is known as PSSP as a kind of an acronym, the decline in the percent change far exceeds the decline in total statewide enrollment, right? So when we hear a lot from folks that would more or less prefer to pretend that schools closing by the dozens is not a problem. We hear from them a lot that this is just natural population loss. West Virginia has lost population, therefore we've lost students, and because we don't have as many students, we don't need as many schools. If it sounds dreadfully oversimplified, it's because it is. The fact of the matter is that the percent of change between 2009 and 26 of school funding has decreased at an accelerated rate, far above and beyond what enrollment decline has been, right? So let's take a look at Randolph County. Full disclosure, I am a proud son of Southern Randolph County. I grew up about 5 miles south of Huttonsville, West Virginia. Went to George Ward Elementary and Tigers Valley High School in Mill Creek, West Virginia. Recently, they've been really going through it in Randolph County. They've had multiple votes of their Board of Education on school closures. Some have not been successful. Recently, there was a vote on Little Colton Elementary and Midland Elementary. That vote failed. But unfortunately, a couple weeks ago, there was a vote to close Harmon and another small school in Elkins, another small grade school. And kind of in the debate, in the back and forth, there were some folks complaining about, well, West Virginia, Randolph County schools have the worst ranking in the entire state, number 55 out of 55. And so it begs the question, is it underperformance or is it underfunded, right? Why did Randolph County struggle so badly? So let's take a look at kind of this. This is a great thing to unpack because it teaches us a lot about school funding and why consistent, steady public funding is important for public education. Randolph County is the largest county in the state. It has more than 2 times the land area than the majority of counties in the state. Because it's a rural school district, Randolph County pays higher operating costs and has to spread those costs across a smaller number of students. So remember that first graph I showed you that showed us $2,000 behind the national average when it came to per pupil spending. Now imagine a county the size of Randolph County, or really a lot of counties in West Virginia that are very rural in nature, and the fact that their transportation costs just to get kids to and from school are going to be significantly higher than a lot of places around the country, right? And then also think about like the fact that you can't just not run the heat in the fall and winter, right? In West Virginia, it's not really an option as it is maybe in other places in the country. These are fixed operating costs, right? These costs never go away. And so they also run higher than the national average. So not only are we funding our schools at significantly lower amounts than the national average, a larger portion of what we have has to go to fixed cost, leaving less for students, right? The answer to this is to address this in an equitable way through public funding, which West Virginia really isn't doing and hasn't been doing. Half the students from Randolph County are for low-income families, as are many public education students in West Virginia. And 1 in 5 have a disability or receive special education services. These students often require more resources to achieve the same outcomes as their peers. Kids who go to Mary C. Snow on the west side of Charleston has a much higher rate of poverty, need more support than kids that go to GW. Or this is kind of a function of building a school system and funding school system off community wealth, right? When areas where property taxes bring in more money, public schools are better because they have more to work with. In areas that have high rates of poverty, like Randolph County, schools generally have less to work with. And really, it's those kids that grow up in more low income circumstances or higher rates of poverty. They do need more investment to be able to achieve the same as communities that have more wealth. It really is a data-driven fact. We then just to build on that, we are an outlier in West Virginia in that we do not account for rates of poverty when distributing money to the public school system. It's a lot more common across the country than it's not to distribute funds based on rates of poverty, right? This is well understood across the country that school districts say, you know what, over here in this part of town, we have much higher rates of poverty. We are going to support these public schools at a greater level. Over here is very, very low poverty. So they don't need quite as much in order to achieve the same success. High poverty school districts in West Virginia get $281 less per kid than low poverty school districts. May not sound like a lot, but if you have a school of 500 kids, that comes out to roughly, hold on, wait for it, $140,000-ish potentially, right? You could have easily, a reading specialist and a math specialist working within a school full time, for that kind of money. Okay, we will on to the next slide. Are there any questions thus far? I want to go ahead. I'm going to try and do this thing where I break it up every couple of slides as opposed to waiting till the end. And where I've almost forgotten what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, then try to have to catch myself up. All right, then. Next slide. Okay, let's get into we've kind of laid the foundation to talk about how we've been underfunding our public school system. I want to talk about how the current system, a voucher system in West Virginia, is also really hurting schools that already don't have enough to work with, and that's through what we call the Hope Scholarship. In Randolph County, um, about 194 students are using the Hope Scholarship in 2025. That is $1 million out of that school system to private schools and homeschoolers, basically. That's what that is, right? So you think of, a school system like Randolph County, West Virginia, or think of it here in other counties where it's much, much more severe. Kanawha County, and the counties that have private schools. There aren't too many counties in West Virginia that have a significant number of private schools. But even in states with a small number like Randolph County, losing 194 students and losing the state funding that comes with that, losing $1 million, can in fact and is closing schools, right? So I'm not saying every single school closure you're reading about is directly related to the Hope Scholarship, but the evidence tells me very clearly that absolutely some of them, if not a significant number of them, are directly related to the students being lost. There's no way around that particular fact. This is basically what vouchers do. I want to give a big shout out to the team here at the Center on Budget and Policy for putting this particular graphic together. Vouchers take your tax dollars and they send them to private schools and leave less for public schools. That's, essentially what voucher programs do. West Virginia's voucher program also is allowed to go to things called micro schools and home school families as well. We have a whole other presentation on that particular side of the coin and the policy there. But from when it comes to a budget perspective, when it comes to, dollars and cents and what your tax dollars go to, think of it this way. It used to be that there was this, pie of money, right? There's this, pot of money. And that pot of money was exclusively reserved for the public school system. Well, now that pot of money is being divvied up between the public school system, the private school system, homeschools, and micro schools. It's being divvied up amongst 5 different school systems. And that pot of money is not getting any bigger, right? And so all that's happening is that the pie isn't getting bigger. The slices are just consistently getting smaller. And really the only people that win under that particular arrangement are wealthier families who could already afford private school in the first place, right? Most private schools in West Virginia, their tuition exceeds what the Hope Scholarship provides, right? The Hope Scholarship stops at about $5,000. Most private schools are more than $5,000 per tuition. Many are significantly more. Additionally, private schools do not provide, by and large, transportation, and they don't often provide meals either. They're allowed to pick their students, and most of them do not accept students with special needs. And so, there are a multitude of problems just with the whole, equity and lack of fairness when it comes to voucher systems. But from a budget perspective, I just want to make it like as clear as I can. What is happening is we are taking an ever dwindling source of public funding and we are divvying it up amongst 5 different education systems when in fact that particular pot of money wasn't sufficient to be doing what needed to be done just for the public school system. And so like this really hurts public education in West Virginia. Right about now, we are paying somewhere about 110 million in public taxpayer dollars. Here are 6 spending alternatives we could be using that money for instead. So for $110 million year over year, we could provide a $2,000 raise. for teachers and school nurses. We could hire 1 to 2 more school psychologists in each county, 4 to 5 more social workers and school counselors in each county, a $2,000 raise for aides, paraprofessionals, and assistant teachers, and a $2,000 raise for all service professionals. Those are the people that cook the meals for the kids and get them to and from school in the buses. An additional 3 to 4 more special education teachers in each county. So when we think about the challenges that our public schools are facing, what you're looking at here through the means of public funding, right? We could choose to send this money to, private schools and other unaccountable education options outside of the public school system. Or if we kept this money here, here's what we could do with it, right? This is a recipe for success, right? This is what, supports all children in West Virginia. And as the public school system is mandated to serve and accept all children in West Virginia, I don't think it's too much to ask that we make sure they're funded properly. Why does this matter, right? Randolph County, like many other school districts across the country, the state, they're less able to offer broad course options to students. I've talked to several of my teachers up there, and they told me electives have all but disappeared. It's nothing but just the basics, and that's about it. Hard to hire staff, hard to retain teachers. Increased education spending leads to better outcomes for students, higher graduation rates, better income as adults, and much lower chances of poverty once you get to adulthood. And the current approach to public school funding really it provides an incentive for school districts to cut staff or close school when funding gets limited. Doesn't adequately account for student background and needs at all, particularly students living in poverty and students with disabilities, and simply does not provide enough support to school districts for staffing teachers and support staff, counselors and social workers. Things are a little different from the days when me and Jesse went to school, right? I'm not saying high school wasn't dramatic and high school wasn't stressful, but kids, we did not, the opioid crisis didn't start until after I graduated from high school. These kids, on a regular basis have to deal with things that we never really would have had to have thought about dealing with. And the pockets of deep poverty in West Virginia have only gotten deeper. In the areas where economic decline was reasonably serious 25 years ago. Well, actually, I'm older than that. I'm not going to completely date myself. Have only gotten worse. The bottom line is that schools, in addition to educating the future of West Virginia, really are community centers, right? And they really should be supported as community centers and centers of wraparound support for children and families. And that takes money. Speaking of money, and we're going to kind of slowly start working our way into kind of the tax and budget side of this. I want to show you all something about what happens when you don't support K through 12 education and you don't support the social well-being and economic stability of families. This particular graph, I really think I think this is one of the most important graphs the Center on Budget and Policy has ever produced, to be 100% honest with you. What's in red are decreases in funding, right? State spending on upfront supports, things like making sure people have access to Medicaid, making sure families have access to child care assistance, the state K through 12 funding formula, PEIA employer premiums, so we can have a good, stable public workforce, higher ed. These have all gone down, significantly so. Like look at Medicaid, child care assistance, state K through 12 funding formula. But take a look at what has increased. The legislature, well, that's pretty audacious. I don't want to, I'll keep my feelings about that to myself. I think some of that has to do with the mural of Baby Dog hanging out in the state capitol these days, and some other long overdue improvements to the building itself. The other public education increase of 6% is almost pretty much entirely Hope Scholarship. So when you see all other public education, don't think that's an increase through K through 12 education. That's not what that is. K through 12 funding has gone down 8%. But look what has really skyrocketed, right? Look at the next two. All other DHHR non-Medicaid, which is primarily foster care and adoption services, right? That's child welfare issues. And then a 38% increase in correctional facilities. And so all of this is to say, if you think education is expensive, wait till you start paying for not supporting public education. Because if you're not supporting K through 12 public education through public financing, through proper, robust public financing, that really doesn't cost much of us if we all chip in and we all chip in what's fair, really doesn't cost that much. But we don't do that. And because we don't do that, what we're doing is we're building more jails and prisons and we're seeing more kids stuck in the foster care system, right? That's so I guess what all of this to say is you're going to pay for it one way or another. It's cheaper if you pay for it up front, right? As opposed to waiting later and you have to deal with the costs of not just underfunding public education, but taking those underfunds away to other things. All right. So why are we in this situation? Well, West Virginia is in this situation because we have a generational problem with leaders just itching to cut taxes, basically. Everybody, well, we're cutting taxes, we're cutting this. This isn't exclusively to beat up on the people who are currently in charge in Charleston. When Democrats were in charge, not long ago, or over a decade ago, and then for a long, they were terrible on taxes. They were no good either. They cut hundreds of millions from the state budget. The Republicans who are in charge now have continued on that trend. So why did they do all this? Well, because the tax cuts are going to bring jobs, except they never did. And matter of fact, not only did they not bring jobs, they continued to not bring jobs year over year over year over year over year over year. The blue line is total non-farm employment growth in the country. The gold line is West Virginia, and the gold line doesn't look real great, to be 100% honest with you. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, we are no better or a little worse off than we were when the business franchise tax and the corporate net income tax started going away, right back in 2009. So when we talk about why K through 12 public education is $2,000 per student behind the rest of the country, this is a big reason why. How do you create a budget gap? You know, I, you know, Governor Morrissey, I don't give him credit for much for several reasons, but I will say that him and his revenue department have been more honest than the previous administration, and they have identified big gaps coming up in state budgets. And so, how exactly do you do that? Well, you cut the personal income tax. That's what PIT stands for. There, PIT collections down 644 million from fiscal year 2023 to 2026. In 2022, that fall, I remember, or was it the summer when I came back from sabbatical? Anyway, it was that year. They finally got their way, and eventually, I think it was after the election. That's right, it was later, and they finally got their way and cut the personal income tax. Um, and the personal income tax represents 40% of the state budget. And so when you cut even the personal income tax by a little, it takes a lot of money away from things that otherwise you could be investing in, like childcare, like K through 12. And so, just within, 3 fiscal years, we're already down $644 million within our state budget that could be used to be funding things that serve all West Virginians. Worse than that, not only are we bringing in less, but this legislature has committed to spending more in multiple areas, right? Which is not what I would call good fiscal management. The area where they intend to spend the most more is the Hope Scholarship, right? Right now, we are about 110 million into it. If the legislature does not act and institute some significant guardrails, next legislative session, the Hope Scholarship is going to blow wide open, and it could run as much as $300 million, right? So taking in hundreds of millions less because we've cut taxes, right? Having to spend hundreds of millions more, right? It's not a pretty picture, right? The only way you do this is you figure out a way to raise taxes somewhere, raise revenues, which I just don't think this particular legislature is going to do, or you institute massive cuts to things like Medicaid, which is already poised for the biggest cut in history, thanks to the big beautiful bill. Higher education, which has been cut year over year over year over year in West Virginia. I think when I went to WVU, it was like $2,400 a semester. Now it's like 8,000 or something to that effect, from what I've heard. That's because when the legislature cuts higher ed, institutions of higher learning respond by raising tuition. That's what they do, right? Well, you're going to give us less. We're going to take more to try and offset the difference. So, this is going to get pretty serious pretty quick, and it's something I would invite you guys to learn more about. We do have a Hope Scholarship, very, very specific with recommendations and this, that, and the other. I'm not going to get into all that tonight. But if you wanted us to come back in the next couple months to talk about that, we would be happy to do so because it is about to get very real. What kind of things are missing from the budget? No permanent solutions for Medicaid. Quite often, over the years, we have significantly diminished our commitment from the state budget to Medicaid, and increased our reliance on what's referred to as the provider tax, which is going to come back and, well, it's not going to be good because it's one of the parts of the big bill that Congress passed this summer to say, well, you can't really do that anymore. So that's something we've seen on the horizon, that there's really no solution to. No solutions for PEIA. Premium increases through the wazoo for public employees and retirees. Getting to the point where simply people can't afford to keep their insurance. We're losing folks, especially in border and even like one county in from border areas, or just they're leaving for Virginia, Pennsylvania, other places. No increase in childcare development. I like to talk about this one a lot because, without direct support to childcare is an education issue, number one. Access to childcare, kids that have access are, clearly doing better in school and like honestly, like leading, stronger, more productive lives as adults. But it has been really difficult to get this legislature to invest in childcare. And even though it's a surefire winner for workforce participation as well. Because, when you don't have access to childcare, you can't afford childcare. One parent almost always has to stay home, right? And can't, work. These are some things we think that like could be in the budget, right? We could have, a year over year commitment to fund Medicaid fully. We could close gaps in PEIA and public education and child care assistance. And people look at that and they're like, oh, we're going to get $560 million. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. This is exactly where we can get $560 million. We can reform our tax brackets. We can add a state earned income tax credit. We can restore the corporate net income tax rate to 2000, a level of 9%. It should go saying that, like, when the corporate net income tax started being reduced, it was supposed to rain jobs in West Virginia. Never happened, right? These tax cuts never bring jobs. All they do is benefit a handful of wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals, and the rest of us are kind of left to pick up the pieces. We can eliminate severance tax preferences, and we can legalize and tax recreational cannabis. These options would bring in roughly about 668 million. When I talk about reforming tax brackets, this is kind of what we're talking about here. The marginal rates for people who are poor really wouldn't change. But if you just started with income over $100,000, and for income between $100,000 and $200,000, you raised the marginal rate from 4.82 to 7%. And then for everything over $200,000, you raised it from 4.82 to 8%. You would raise a ton of money. And so you would only impact people who have income, and only their income over $100,000 would see any change whatsoever. And so that's how marginal tax rates work, right? So when you see 100,001 to $200,000 and you see an increase to 7%, that doesn't mean that the money from $1 to $99,999 changes at all. The tax rate for that all stays the same. It's only so if somebody's making $120,000 a year, the only tax increase they would see is on that last 20,000, if that makes sense to folks. It took me a while to like wrap my head around that whole idea. So I like to make sure that I take a minute to explain it, which is odd considering, oh dear. Oh, where am I? Okay. I believe that is 30 minutes on the nose. I'm not sure how good a job I did. I always get real self-conscious when I do these things. But I would like to, what we have here. Paula, I believe, had a question. Yes, I think it's absolutely fair to assume that there will be more consolidations throughout the state, especially if we don't rein in the Hope Scholarship. And by rein it in, I mean what needs to happen is there needs to be a cap, you can have 15 million and that's it. And there need to be some other guardrails like, maximums on household income. Doctors and lawyers making, three, four, $500,000 a year don't need to be accessing $5,000 in state taxpayer money to send their kids to a private school that they could afford to send them to in the first place. That's just wrong, right? And to be honest with you, it's 100% inconsistent with the rationale of the people who wanted to see it passed when they were passing it, right? In 2021, they sold this for the poor kids, right? Well, actually, it's the communities that are struggling the most that love their public schools the most. They want their kids to continue to go in public school.
I have a question.
What's up?
Um, you were talking about the Hope Scholarship, and I think you said you had a program. Could you quickly uh, explain just a little bit about where that money goes once it gets into the Hope Scholarship, and maybe you know we've talked about it a lot here on this Zoom, and we really haven't had any expert come in. So maybe I would have you come back and do another presentation on just the Hope Scholarship and explain that and where that I know where the money comes from. It comes from you and me and
Yeah.
everybody else. But why is it why is it only going to those private schools? And does it go to any? Is it eligible to go to anything else besides a private school somewhere?
Yes. So you cannot have you cannot be a kid in public school and receive the Hope Scholarship. You have to
Right.
be attending a private school. You have to be homeschooled, or you have to be going to a micro school or what they call a micro pod in some places. One of the things that I think, just as a taxpayer, should upset everybody is that there is zero accountability to any school that or any education option that receives the Hope Scholarship. Absolutely none. Right now, we can go to the West Virginia Department of Education's website, and you can look up the test results and scores for every public school in the state of West Virginia. You can't do that for entities that receive the Hope Scholarship, right? Nobody really knows if these kids are learning anything at all. And while it is true that there are a handful of very well publicized, very well resourced private schools in West Virginia, they do not represent in my feeling, the average institution that is accepting Hope Scholarship money. We are seeing quote unquote schools just pop up anywhere. Especially you go to places with more population, you'll see a sign hanging outside of what looks like a house saying, come, spend your Hope Scholarship here at this particular academy or this. And nobody knows at all,
Mhm.
what these kids or if these kids are learning. I do believe upwards of 50% are going to schools that are unaccredited. That's a serious issue. We have money leaving the state, taxpayer dollars leaving West Virginia. I know in not just Randolph County, but places I've been to, there's a huge concern about parents who are well-meaning and thinking they have found a good option for their kid outside of the public school system. They take them out, they put them in a micro school, they put them in maybe this newfound, private school in the neighborhood. They think they've made a good decision, and they don't find out until 6 months or a year later that their kid hasn't really been learning anything. And so that kid has to go back into the public school system. They're a year behind. And this is not just an isolated incident. We're hearing about this in multiple counties. And we actually have done FOIAs that have shown, some counties keeping track of this with dozens of kids coming back within the same year. And it's adding enormous stress to teachers and school support staff, in addition to students who didn't leave in the first place. Because what happens is that kid is behind. The teacher doesn't have the resources to focus on them and the other students. So, the other students end up suffering as well. Like that's one issue we know is a serious problem happening just kind of within the context. Again, because there's no accountability, right? These are public taxpayer dollars, but these schools don't have to prove that they're competent to be doing what supposed to be doing, and they don't have to test. They don't have to test or show. Now, private schools have to test, but they don't have to make their results public. Micro schools, nobody knows what's going on, and I'm pretty much at this point, homeschools don't really. No, nobody knows what's happening there either.
So they can use this money as funding for their homeschool as well, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so basically they've passed this. There's no real oversight, I guess, on this money once it gets into that fund. I suppose the legislature could do it if they wanted to do it. They could do some oversight, but there, like you said, there's no accountability. So that's amazing to me.
it's terrifying. I'll be honest. I mean,
It
like
really is.
I really, I mean, you're talking thousands of kids.
Yeah.
Uh, and like I said, not every private school is Charleston Catholic. I mean, like I'm not a fan at all of sending public taxpayer dollars anywhere but the public school system. But I can at least say that like, at least an accredited private school that a kid is likely to get an education there. If your school has an accreditation that's recognized by the West Virginia Department of Education, then I think it's fair to assume, okay, at least in that, like that's a guardrail. That's a guardrail we're putting out there saying, listen, you can't send public taxpayer dollars for the purposes of education to anything but an accredited school. Like the school should have to be accredited. Like we need to know that they have the staff, the education, with the staff and the facilities necessary for these kids to be learning if we're going to send taxpayer dollars there. But you'd be surprised the resistance we get just from that. Jesse, what's up?
Thanks, Seth, and it was great seeing you.
Two.
It's been a while. Um, like on one hand, I'm extremely concerned about that lack of accountability for the Hope Scholarship, but I also really appreciate the budgetary part of it and really you laying out like just potential solutions. Like there are solutions available and what that mix might look like might change because educating kids is obviously important for the future of West Virginia. Um, but I wonder, like, having observed the 2025 legislature and the same folks coming back, yet we also have this really big budgetary cliff that we see looming.
Yeah.
Um, so this is maybe a two-part question. Do you see a sort of appetite for solutions in the next legislative session where they might be open to these sorts of things? Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
So is it going to take us falling over this cliff and really getting ourselves in a huge budgetary mess? Would that mix up elections? Would we have to have like a whole new legislature to solve this? Like, would we, I guess my question is, are we anticipating feeling a lot of pain before we get to the solutions,
So
even though they're there?
I think maybe I answered too quickly. I don't see this legislature raising revenues. To be 100% honest with you, we are going to push. We are going to try to, especially lean in on revenues that are exportable. For those who don't know tax lingo, exportability is kind of like my favorite concept in taxation, especially in a state like West Virginia that relies heavily on natural resource extraction. Exportability means we are going to raise revenue in a way in which your constituents are going to not have to pay any or much of it at all, right? So when we talk about things like the natural gas severance tax, I think it should be 25%. And one of the reasons I think it should be 25% is because once natural gas leaves the ground, it's gone. That's it. You don't regrow it. And the other reason, and maybe the more important reason, is that almost all of this stuff is controlled by people who don't live here, right? And so if we raise, hundreds of millions of dollars off the natural gas severance tax, that's not money that's coming out of the pockets of people West Virginia. So you can say the same about like the coal severance tax. There's like one called the excess acreage tax, where you charge a little more per acre for these giant land holding companies, basically coal companies and timber companies that have these gazillions of acres of land that just sits, right, doesn't do anything. And so you can levy revenue against that and draw that in. And so we're going to go after it. We surely are. But this particular bunch, I got to be honest, it's not just it's not just one party, right? Like both, I know there's only 11 Democrats in the state legislature, and I think in the personal income tax we managed to hold on to three. I think it was Delegate Pushkin, Delegate Danielle Walker at the time, and then Delegate Evan Hansen were the only three who said no, we're not doing that. So like when it comes to taxes, there's a lot of work to do. I don't know that it's going to happen this year. I do think there is significant interest in really reining in the cost of the voucher. So I think that like there could be some progress made on that side of it, just being like, no, this is not going to get anywhere near $300 million. We're gonna rein this in and basically say you can have this much, but it has to be spent in accordance to these rules. We are seeing some significant traction on that particular side of things, but there's going to be resistance. There's going to be, there's going to be, like I said, there's nothing easy down there, right? Like getting a drink of water takes a lot of work at the state legislature. Like everything is hard. So,
And may I ask a follow-up question?
of course,
Um, so let's say that they do somehow come to an agreement, either 26, 27, on how to raise revenue.
yeah,
If they were to do that and come together, agree that maybe, it could be that exportable taxes or whatever, maybe they agree to it, they do it, we raise that revenue. Would they actually, another thing I worry about, maybe this is beyond the scope of this conversation, but I don't really think so. Would they actually dedicate that increased raise of revenue or the reining in of the Hope Scholarship dollars? Would they dedicate that money to these areas, to childcare, to K-12? Would it go somewhere else? Like, I know that's asking you to predict the future, but
I
I'm
think
just curious.
I think the political backlash to what vouchers are doing to community schools in most parts of the state is in fact galvanizing into something that I would refer to as political power, even, dare I say. And also one of the more potent types of political power, one that is truly bottom up, right? It's not really being dictated by, the unions or the mighty Center on Budget and Policy, if you will, right? That's a little, having a little fun with myself there. What you're seeing is communities seeing through the propaganda that is used to prop up vouchers and saying, no, you're taking money away from our county schools, and now two schools have to close. We understand exactly what's happening here, right? Oh, and by the way, now my taxpayer dollars are supporting things that clearly aren't education, and in several instances paying for wealthier families who could already afford this in the first place to send their kids to a private school at the expense of the choices that the rest of the kids in public school have to work with. I do see a movement truly building around that, and I see the kind of movement that can either lead to potential changes in personnel, or just basically force the issue to where people see the writing on the wall. Will that happen all in one year next year? Most likely not. I do think that it's going to take kind of a multi-year effort, and some communities are really going to have to feel some pain. But we've really had some. I mean, I wouldn't say we, but like the other really big grassroots movement in West Virginia from a policy perspective is the childcare movement. They have done, the folks at West Virginians young child, I can't remember, it's Christy Ritz and like Amy Jo and Tiffany, and there's Jim McKay and that whole bunch. Kelly, my executive director, is really close with that crew. They have really engaged in a very strong grassroots campaign. And I think that, to the point where they have pulled members of the supermajority on the record voting in favor of childcare. I see them hopefully making some progress, but again, it's going to take money. And the big problem right now is that, we are living in kind of a scarcity, not just a scare, like we have deliberately given ourselves less to work with year over year over year by cutting taxes, while throwing more and more money at other things that are just ineffective, if not outright damaging. So like, we have to get it coming and going. Like we have got to rein in the damage, especially on what we're spending money out of control on, and we have to raise revenue and then talk people into using that revenue for things like childcare and stabilizing insurance for public employees so we can have a stable public workforce and things like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't understand the big push from the legislature and the governor to lower personal income taxes. I mean, I know that people are paying their taxes, and it's some people are having trouble doing that. But when you look at that and the damage that it's doing to the state budget and to all the programs that we've talked about tonight, it's craziness, I think. And using some of that money that would go into the Hope Scholarship, though. This year, I think you said we're up to 100 million, and next year it may be up to 360 million. So, is it going to top itself out eventually, or is it just going to continue to grow? And then where would that money come from? If we don't have personal income taxes, also the tax breaks to bring in um, businesses trying to get, like you said, people to work. Those kinds of things just haven't worked year after year after year.
Yeah.
So
Well, I tell you, I mean,
tough. It's a tough question.
I have it on good authority from friends of mine that work in the whole, I don't know, what do you call it, the economic development space. Basically, people whose jobs it is to try and recruit and talk to businesses and get them to locate in West Virginia. And I've heard from more than a few folks that like West Virginia has very precipitously slid off the radar, if not is no longer on the radar for a lot of companies. And one of the reasons is because of what we're doing to our public education system and the fact that it's not uncommon knowledge that we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars with no evidence that kids are getting schooling. And so, companies need two things, right? They need a healthy, well-educated workforce. Those are like the two big things. West Virginia doesn't really rank very well in the healthy part most times. We've done a little better with the expansion of Medicaid, but now that's under threat, significant threat. And at the state level, we just aren't funding Medicaid, consistently enough. And those chickens are about to come home to roost. Former Governor Justice got away with having $12 billion in federal pandemic aid come into his state during his second term, right? Like that was the only reason he was able to stabilize budgets, brag about surpluses, that and a few budget gimmicks here and there as to what he did with the state budget and the revenue estimates. But I mean, the bottom line is those days are over. And so, we cut taxes under this charade of a rocket ship ride, a charade that was, built on mismanagement of COVID relief funds. And, I don't necessarily mean anything illegal. It's just they spent it on really just dumb things. You shouldn't have given $300 million to Nucor. Shouldn't have, you know what I mean? Like you shouldn't have handed over hundreds of millions of dollars to the unemployment trust fund. So Walmart's, unemployment tax would go down, half a penny so they could make an extra, million or $2 million over the course of the year, which we did. And that money's not around anymore. And not only that, we have less revenue coming in because we cut taxes during this, particular period, right? Even outside of the enigma and the conundrum of the Hope Scholarship exploding in cost, there are going to be some other significant areas we're going to have to, figure out how to address. And when I say figure out how to address, what I really mean is raise money and spend it wisely. Raise money and invest it in the people of West Virginia. I think I might have a question or two here in the chat. Well, maybe not. But it's good to see you all mixing it up.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions out there?
I have a question. I don't have my hand up. But, I'm over in Maryland, and I live in Garrett County, and it's considered a rural county. And one of the things I noticed in the funding and the way in which legislation is created is most of it's created for the urban areas. And so the focus is on urban needs, urban populations, and so forth. But with the rural population that we have, and we have about 6 or 7 counties that are considered rural, the funding and the approach is totally different and needs to be adjusted. One area in particular, we were talking about the child care. That has really upset me because the child care in our county starts at 3, okay? Because that's all they can afford. The most important period in child care is the age from 6 months to 3 years of age, as far as the child's development, okay? And I look at this as somewhat of a, you're familiar with redlining and housing?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I consider this an education version of redlining because children who live in disadvantaged situations and poor and so forth, they will not get the opportunity to start off in the same level playing field that Johnny does, who has a mother and father that have college education and so forth. And so trying to redesign that. One of the ways in which I saw to redesign it is possibly because employers are the ones that benefit the most from childcare, if it's available. All right. And because those women then enter the workforce, their children are taken care of, so forth and so on. And one of the ways to offset that cost, because of the fact that they are the ones benefiting from it, is that they would contribute for each child of their employees, that they will contribute a certain amount of money to the coffers to offset the cost of the child care. And there are a number of people that agree with the idea, but most of them are the consumers and not the payers. So what is your thoughts on those type of things to try and improve the child care aspect of it?
Excuse me. I'm a bit skeptical about like business centric childcare. I think if companies like Toyota or other big employers, and I applaud employers who provide childcare built into salaries, or some employers will like have, I want to say, like bulk deals with childcare centers, or just build one within their own company's facility. I don't hear a ton about that in West Virginia. But I think we're all better off with the recognition that equitable access to quality childcare, especially birth to three type childcare, just requires public investment. And in order for communities that historically have been redlined, that have been pushed out of prosperity, deliberately and by design, the only way to address that particular type of inequity is to have an equitable tax system that directly subsidizes those families and other families to have access to quality childcare. And so again, I think the best way to do it is just to make it universal. And again, I think that when you look at how West Virginia spends its money and how we don't spend our money, these are in fact policy choices, right? Like we don't have to spend hundreds of millions, or we don't have to cut hundreds of millions year after year after year after year. We could be investing these dollars in significant childcare improvements and significant improvements in access for all families. We just simply don't do it in West Virginia.
I would love to have the universal child care.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at it, and now one of the points that I make is that you wouldn't be paying to operate your own center. You would be contributed to a fund, which would then allocate the money to another center where the child would go.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're talking about similar things. I mean, I think there's other big challenges when it comes to rural communities as well. One of the bigger problems in childcare in West Virginia is just any type of access. There are a lot of counties that just simply have no access to childcare.
Right.
A lot of that also comes down to transportation issues and rurality of how far you would have to drive. If you have to drive your kid 30 minutes to drop them off at a childcare and then drive another hour in the same opposite direction just to get to work, at some point you hit kind of a point of no return, or diminishing investments, or
Right.
returns, if you will. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Good talking to you. Rick, everyone, thank you so much. I hope I didn't meander or babble too much.
No, you did great. I thought
Got it.
it was very informative, and I do appreciate you coming tonight and giving us your insight, because that's, we've talked about it and talked about it, and this clears up a lot of things that, I think some people just weren't sure about, so including me. So I appreciate you being here.
Appreciate you all. And it's great to see you, Jesse. Are you coming down to Charleston anytime soon? Okay. All right. Good. Folks, have a good rest of your Thursday evening. Have a great Halloween. I'm excited. Halloween, I live in the east end of Charleston. Halloween is one of the best nights of the year. Kids come from all over the Kanawha Valley, and they're just everywhere in their costumes, running around with candy. Just good times, a lot of joy. So I hope you guys get to experience the same, and maybe we'll do this again some point in the near future.
All right.
Take care.